Hey everybody, I'm Bill Calkins, Senior Editor with Grower Talks, and believe it or not, it's poinsettia time. You're probably receiving cuttings at the greenhouse, and if not, they're probably on the way. Today's webinar is certainly timely as we're joined by representatives from Selecta One for a discussion about poinsettia production. This is the first in a three-part series, and our topic centers on the earliest stages from stick through pinch. I'm excited to be joined by three experts who've grown a heck of a lot of poinsettias and now represent Selecta One working with growers across North America. Our first guest today is Jason Twiddell. He's coming to us from Ohio. Jason, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks, Bill. We're excited to be here.
Awesome. And our next guest is Gary Vollmer, who's coming to us live from the beautiful Pacific Northwest. How are things going up there, Gary?
It's a beautiful sunny spring day or summer day. We love it. Hummingbirds are buzzing, flowers are blooming. Business is good up here.
Cool, cool. And finally, we have James Dukas in the great state of Maryland. James, what's going on up on the East Coast?
Just as great as the West Coast, apparently, because it's sun shining. Temperatures have cooled off nicely.
Excellent, excellent. That is great to hear. Well, I really appreciate you guys joining us. Before we get started, we're going to do just a little bit of housekeeping. As always, this webinar will be archived and available at growertalks.com/webinars. In addition, if you have questions during this webinar, please post them in the Q&A section. Our panelists might see your question and answer it on the fly, but more likely, I'm going to come back in at the end and do my best to ask the questions that you post to our panelists, and they're going to give their answers and share their contact information if you do have additional comments or questions or anything specific to go through. So, gentlemen, I really appreciate your time today and the fact that you're going to share all this great technical information to help the viewers get their poinsettias off to a great start. But that's enough out of me. Gary, the screen is all yours.
All right, here we go. All right, we looking good?
Yep, we got it. All right. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Gary, for getting it up on the screen. We're excited to have everybody here. Thanks for taking a little bit of time away from your busy schedule to go through some technical poinsettia information. We're going to go, as Bill said, from sticking the cuttings through pinch. For some of you, there's already poinsettias in the greenhouse. For others, the crop hasn't quite arrived yet, but it'll be coming soon. For those of you that get liners in, you're probably a few weeks away from getting that product. But we're excited to have you guys here. We're excited to share this information, and as we said, we're happy to answer questions as we get towards the end of the webinar. Next slide, Gary, please. Thank you. All right, so we're going to touch on different aspects of propagation. We'll cover sanitation. We'll go through propagation on unrooted cuttings, media, the different stages of prop. So we're going to try to go in depth and in detail in the different stages of propagation and through transplant until we get to pinching. So with that, I think we'll pass it on to James to get into our first slide here.
All right, so like any crop, you want to start clean and end clean. So before your cuttings even arrive, develop a nice written sanitation protocol, have a plan in place, disinfect all your clean surfaces, look over your worker sanitation, make sure that we're washing hands before we're handling any sort of cuttings or poinsettias or media, as well as maybe deploying some gloves as well. Foot paths might be preferred for your application, making sure that you don't have anything really tracking through your nice clean prop house, and make sure that you're in that prop house, you're disinfecting everything, especially the floors. It seems to be a missed thing because that's where your primary pest for propagation, fungus gnats, is going to start to breed first and then get into your media. So use your quaternary ammonia-based disinfectants, peroxide, any other oxidizing agent. So when you receive your cuttings, have a protocol for that as well. Make sure, delineate who's taking the boxes in and making sure that, okay, we're not just checking and making sure we're getting our whole order in, but we're also checking the temperatures. So use an infrared thermometer and check the outside of the box, the inside of the box for the poinsettias, shoot the tissue of the material, as well as also take shoot the ice pack in the center. That'll give you your easiest sort of history. If it's been a long journey where they've been a little warm, that ice will be completely melted and be up to maybe high 60s. You know, that's a good protocol to get in place. Now, if your temperatures are as well as practical, you know, if you can store the cuttings overnight, but you know, that's not necessarily required. If you get like a warm shipment in, go to the next slide, Gary.
Sorry.
Right now, especially during this time of COVID, parcel services such as FedEx and UPS are having difficulty keeping up with demand and really are kind of bending their rules for time of delivery. So it's more than likely poinsettias are going to come in a little bit warmer than usual in past years. So again, check your cooler prior to doing anything, a couple more days before, put a min-max, trust, but also verify. Make sure that it's not getting too cold as that cooler starts to cool back down. We don't want to get anything really below 48. I mean, ideally we want to stay 50, all right?
And I want to pipe in one other thing that's really important. Coolers draw moisture out of things, so the process of cooling. So you want to make sure that your cuttings are very moist in there. And I think, you know, trying to get ethylene gas away from the cutting, so get the bag open or out of the bag, and then, but don't lose all your moisture. You want the moisture, but you want the gases out.
Yep, and you know, if you can, cool the cuttings for a minimum 4 hours. Best to do overnight. After this cooling process, your cuttings should be firm and turgid. And this is actually a little bit self-checked, so you don't end up using your propagation material on something that didn't arrive and that will never make, and waste your labor, and then you're going to chase your tail and throwing it away in the first place. So having that little bit of buffer time where that cutting can recover in the cooler, regain moisture, and cool back down from the shipping process is in everyone's best interest. And then I believe Gary's going to take us through media.
Yeah. So, you know, historically, way back, people would stick in cells and just loose media, and that's okay. But the problem with the poinsettia is a coarse root. And that coarse root, if you try to lift that that open soil cell, the soil will fall away. So poinsettias are primarily stuck in some form of stabilized media. And I encourage you to do that. The other method is direct stick. So we'll kind of go through the different processes of going through the media, different mediums, and get the ball rolling. So it's important to get your cuttings stuck ASAP if they are fresh. If you, as James was talking about, if they come in warm at all, or if they come in wilty, if they look wilty and they're rubbery, then I would encourage you to hydrate them and cool them. And the idea is, what you want is you want a firm, crisp cutting. You want to be able to, if you break that cutting, it's going to snap. It's not going to bend and just go mwah. So if you have that, you get it under mist ASAP. If not, you cool it and prepare it, but with moisture and cold. 50 degrees, as James said, out. Always apply rooting hormone. Poinsettias definitely even out the rooting across the cuttings with some hormone applications. In the beginning stages, you want to keep the mist levels high. They should start forming callus and roots in about 5 to 7 days, and we'll get into that a little bit more. In a loose fill or direct stick, make sure that you have a hole that isn't too big for the cutting to slide. You need the contact with the soil when you stick the cutting, and we'll get into that here in a sec. Stage 1 environment. You can propagate poinsettias with very low light, and I think it's important to take the infrared from the sunlight off of the cutting. You don't need much light in the first few days. It's very important to get that cutting healed. You're all about keeping that cutting turgid. That's the key as it establishes. So too low light level is almost an impossible thing to do when you stick a cutting. Yes, there's some bottom limits, but with the exception of pulling a blackout, you can pretty much shade it deeply, and that will help, especially if you're in a hot climate or it's very hot conditions. The most difficult aspect of the environment on propagation is keeping it cool enough for the poinsettias. And in most regions, at the time of year you're propagating poinsettias, our biggest challenge is heat. So far, we haven't had radical heat this year during sticking season, so knock on wood, we're going to continue that trend. But it's a big issue. Maintain high humidity around it. Keep your floors wet. You just definitely need to create an environment, especially in the first few days, of just humid and as cool and as shady as you can make it. Once they get established, then you can begin to increase the amount of light you can give them, or reduce the amount of humidity and mist. Don't over mist. It's very important. You want to mist to keep the leaves turgid. You don't want to see the backside of the leaves. When they turn over and they're showing you the white, that means they're starting to dry out. But you don't want to over mist. You don't want water standing everywhere. Free water standing in tissue, especially if you've got some wetting agent involved, you can hypersaturate that tissue. You have to be careful with the wetting agents. You don't want to use too much, because if it gets too deep into the tissue, you'll get some breakdown on those growing tips. But capsule is a great thing to make the mist more efficient. It helps to keep the water spread over, and you don't have to mist as often.
Gary, if I can add one thing on the environment there in stage one, traveling around and visiting growers. Of course, we're not doing that so much this year, but in the past and in my previous experience in propagation, it's really the highlight that gets you into trouble in that stage one situation, because if you don't shade enough, too much heat ends up in the, too much radiation ends up in the compartment. The temperatures go too high. You get additional disease pressure. You have to mist more. It just creates a really challenging cycle. And so I don't think we can emphasize enough the need to get the light levels down, especially in highlight areas. And a lot of that is not letting the light ever get into the compartment. So painting the roof, getting up in the gutters and putting paint on the roof and keeping that radiation out of the compartment is really an important part of success for stage one in prop.
I've been in situations where we pulled black cloth and just left about a foot gap open under the gutters, and then misted those edges like crazy to try to manage the rest of the environment and keep the whole mass, the infrared energy in that mass, low enough so that the whole greenhouse didn't heat up too much. It wasn't pretty, but it worked quite effectively. So yeah,
on our slide, we've got less than 2,000 foot candles. I mean, you can get down into the 1,000 to 1,250 to 1,500 and be okay, especially in the first few days.
Absolutely. At the beginning, like I said, I don't think you can be too dark in the beginning.
Yeah.
I really don't. But then as they begin to heal, then you can begin to wean them into more light. Just leave your shades open longer in the mornings. Maybe on cloudy days, keep them open, things like that as you progress.
Yeah.
So,
yep. Okay.
Yeah, I think moisture management is critical here right now. And Jason, I want you to take over the conversation.
All right. So let's talk moisture management. We were just talking about environment. Gary was talking about mist. Whether you're using fog or whether you're using booms to mist the cuttings, the environment, the humidity in that compartment is important, but we also have to think about soil moisture. So, during propagation, especially in the first few days, soil moisture it's important that we've got moist soil, that the products or the media is pretty wet. Too dry is certainly a problem because it can pull moisture away from that cutting. And too wet is going to be a challenge as you get towards the end of stage one, but you'd rather err on the side of a little bit too wet. So, at Ball and Selecta, we talk a lot about a level 1 through 5 media moisture management or media scale. We'd like to be around a level 4, which is wet but not saturated. That's kind of the sweet spot there. And as I said, as you get towards the end of stage one and you're callousing and starting to initiate roots, that's when you really need to be very mindful of where your soil moisture is. So then, we talk about misting and controlling the humidity within the environment. For most growers, it's most likely either a drop-down 4-way emitter or it's a boom running over the top of the crop. In this case, you can see this is direct stuck poinsettias on the floor, and this product is as you look at it, if the boom's running over the top of that, you can see how much soil is actually showing. So I think this is just a good picture to indicate that every time a mist event or every time a boom passes over the top of that crop, an enormous amount of that water is actually going in the soil. It's not hitting the leaf and maintaining the turgidity of that cutting so much as it is saturating the soil. So it is a challenge. I personally prefer direct sticking my poinsettias. Eliminate the cost of liner production in the transplant. But you do have to be mindful of that. Now, if you've got a good, well-drained mix, you can still keep some air in that soil, but it's just something to be mindful of. I think that picture really just illustrates how much soil surface is showing in a direct stick.
I think the
scenario.
point can't be overstated though when you're running a boom. Just knowing what that nozzle is putting out for that mist event. You don't want a high volume. You want a very fine mist, so you do have a little bit of dry down in that media. I've seen people try to do direct stick where they just have too much volume going down for an event. And you're just sitting at it. They eventually get to a level 5 and you're just sitting in a saturated mess, and that'll eventually delay your callousing.
Yeah, and that's definitely the number one problem you see in direct stick is too much water. And how you mitigate that, keeping the leaves turgid without supersaturating the soil. As James pointed out, things you can do mitigating, especially in boom scenarios, is I've seen, tilting the boom horizontally so that the boom, or even tilting it upward slightly so that the more mist will go up and then fall down. I think there's merits to that in disease management as well, as the mist isn't going down, and mist will come down and go like this from a fan nozzle pointing downward. If the nozzle is arced like this, it's just going to rain down on top. So you're less lateral movement, more stays in the air. I've seen to great effect mounting a sort of a fine mist type propagation nozzle, a Netafim propagation mist nozzle on booms. And that's an extraordinarily nice effect. Again, less actual water is getting into the soil, but you're putting a lot of water into the environment. That's the key. The other thing is,
ideally we're increasing relative humidity and not putting water directly on the plant, right? We don't necessarily want free moisture. We want very high relative humidity. The other thing on booms is, make sure the speed of that boom is going as fast as it can go without the boom itself starting to fall apart. So, slow boom passes are great for irrigating crops, but they're not great for misting crops. So keep your speed up.
Make sure you get the right nozzle on there. Put a fine nozzle for sure.
Orange.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we'll talk fertility real quick in stage 1. Not a huge issue in terms of, the plants aren't really taking up a lot of the nutrition that you're going to be putting out. And obviously leaching is a challenge in propagation, as we've talked about, if you overmist. But when you get to the back end of stage 1, you're going to start to callus. You're going to start to transfer water between the cutting and the soil. And at that point, you want to have a little bit of EC in there. And so what I've found, and one of the best ways to do that is to have, to utilize a foliar fertilization. Put a little bit of feed in that mist so that, if you are, or as you do build up moisture in the soil, it's actually got a little bit of EC in it. And even though you're leaching it out, perhaps, there's still some fertilizer content in there. So we recommend approximately somewhere around a 50 part per million with low to most, the best scenario would be 0 phosphorus in that foliar fertilizer.
Yeah, definitely got to be beware of your phosphorus at this point. I've seen, I know growers that have a very effective use of nature source at this juncture as their first feeds in propagation, because it will give you the complete feed, and it just doesn't act like a phosphorus bearing feed.
Yeah, it's a tough one though, I think, for overhead in the mist system because of plugging up nozzles. But
yeah.
Okay. Next slide there, Gary. So just to expand a little bit more on phosphorus, if you've propagated poinsettias with overhead mist, you've seen these strapped leaves in that picture there on the right-hand side. That's pretty standard. If you've got a little bit too much phosphorus in the water or water quality is a challenge, you'll see those strapped leaves. Probably means you overmisted a little bit as well. I've seen that for sure in the past. And so that's why we would recommend any kind of foliar feed has 0 phosphorus in it. And, but what we don't want to create is what could be called phosphobia, where you're just scared to use any kind of phosphorus, because as these plants start to root and start to grow, you're going to need phosphorus to be a part of the complete fertilizer package. We don't want to have any kind of a phosphorus deficiency starting up on those lower leaves.
So I just wanted to pipe in here. This is as a guy, I travel all over looking at poinsettias, and I've watched this trend, certainly evolve to go to these very low or no phosphorus regimes and feeding earlier. And what we see a lot of is with guys doing just like 14-0-14 or 17-0-17, 15-0-15 as their feeds in prop. They'll come out of prop showing this, and this is phosphorus deficiencies. You see that little kind of rabbit tracky thing, and it's a very kind of unique, distinct pattern. We've always never really paid a lot of attention to it. But what we do see is when you do have that, there is a little bit of slowdown in the grow out. So you just kind of keep an eye on that lower leaf. That's a good indicator that when you do get it transplanted, that you probably will want to make sure you give it a good shot of a full, complete feed to replace the phosphorus, which has been depleted in prop.
Gary, what EC, now naturally during this time, you're more likely don't have a starter charge in and you're building your EC, but we haven't really got to a callus. So, really you're kind of targeting a very low EC media, but eventually would want to build in propagation. To what type of EC would you kind of range give as being ideal?
Well, I think that's a really loaded question, James, because it's going to totally depend on the medium that you're in. If you're in a medium that's like an Elipot, for example, where you're going to hold some more moisture, you're going to hold more nutrient because you have a medium in the cube or in the sleeve, versus something like an Oasis, which is kind of an inert medium that has no cation exchange, no ability to hold it. So I don't like to talk about meaty EC in the early stages at all. I like to think about what are you doing to that foliage? Are you leaching all the feed out? Are you giving it a chance to replenish that feed in the foliage that you're leaching out? When you get a root on it and you start to grow, then you want to get to a point where you get them actively growing. I think you want to avoid a high EC to stunt the roots. And I think in a very wet environment you're talking about there in propagation, moist, you want to be careful not to drive the EC up too high, because as they will dry down, as they root out, then the EC will raise. It'll be too high. Those roots will be stressed. They'll damage the roots. So I don't think you should go above about a 1.5 max in prop medium, but it's a hard way to kind of think about it in propagation.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I asked, so we can have a little bit of a discussion about it.
Yeah, it is. It is one of those. I mean, I'm one of these guys that always preaches. I'm more concerned about what's coming out of the hose going into a crop if you're on a constant liquid feed regime, and what is the pH. The EC, if it's very actively growing poinsettia, the EC will go away fast. So that's another conversation for the next webinar.
Yep.
James?
Yeah, fungus gnats are your #1 primary concern in insect control. So again, sanitation is your best friend in planting early. Make sure you're algae free, put up some sticky cards, and monitor your moisture, because we don't want to then develop excess moisture in our media, growing some algae, and then having a source of food on our propagation media. This is the time you want to apply some maybe IGRs. This is also a great time to deploy nematodes. Nematodes at a long-term crop like this, it just seemed to really make sense for especially targeting that larva stage. That's going to be your challenge. It's not so much the adult, it's the larva going to be eating away the inside of that bottom tip of that callus or that poinsettia right there. So just little tips on doing that if you are looking or trying to use nematodes in your situation. You want to apply them either in the morning or the afternoon when it's a little coolest in your greenhouse. Make sure that you take any 50 mesh filters off your injection equipment, right? And don't be using any high pressure injection equipment. So a regular injector is fine, but you don't want to use a high injection pump and anything above, something below 300 PSI. And then make sure you're agitating that solution regularly. And don't forget to rinse out that, just like you would any chemical triple rinse at the very end of using it. Make sure you're rinsing out that tray or whatever you're using to then put into your regular 4-gallon bucket for injection. Just getting every little bit of that nematode in solution.
Yeah, I think they're great. I think they work great. I think one of the biggest challenges is
When I say cooler in the afternoon, I really mean late evening when that sun is kind of crested and started to cool off.
yeah, yeah. It's just you can never get dry. I mean, in propagation, I think it's wonderful. They're great and finished too, but you just can't get dry. They die.
And building off of what Jason said for medium moisture, really when you go to apply any of these sorts of things, it's just like a normal PGR drench. You want to be at a medium moisture of about a 3, so it's going to accept it in and distribute out. You don't want to apply it to where it's sloshing over or spilling out and leaching as well. So you want a little bit of moisture in there. You want to be about a 3 and go up to a 4. Here's just some examples of some other biocontrols that you can use in your propagation area. There's predators that you can then use, as well as your nematodes. And then we also have, of course, your biological funguses as well to attack some of your insects. And all this information and a lot of chemicals, charts that we recommend that can be used on poinsettias at its various stages can be found in the Selecta One catalog. So your best resource really is our catalog for poinsettias, as well as a culture guide, as well as online at selectanorthamerica.com. In stage 1 disease control, your primary problems are going to be Erwinia and botrytis. Erwinia can be your primary, and then botrytis end up following it. So kind of know what's coming first, the chicken or the egg, because that can lead to what you're actually trying to target here. I guess preventative controls, so applying some fungicides in the early stages to prevent botrytis from developing in that high humidity situation, low light area. That would be a good strategy. And also balancing your mist, so we're not, during the low light situation of the nighttime and evening, you're not just putting excess water out there tremendously.
And I think this is a good time to talk about water treatment options as well.
Totally.
You can mitigate a lot of these issues by having some sort of sanitizing agent, either an oxygen peroxide type based product, or chlorine, or the chlorine dioxides, or copper ionizations. But bottom line, treated sanitized water will help prevent this. It'll also help prevent the spread of the pathogens or the diseases as they get started here.
To your point earlier, having, if you have a situation where you have the nozzles directed down, they're forcing potentially that Erwinia to travel to its neighbor, as opposed to having a light mist just fall on top of the cuttings, therefore not pushing that issue to its neighbors.
I think that's a good point. It's just general propagation strategy, but very relevant and hyper important on poinsettias, is to try to avoid the lateral movement of water. A lot of bad things move through water, and we don't want that water moving from plant to plant. We want it moving from irrigation device to the plant and to the medium, and then out the drain. So, or recaptured, but you do not want to spread water laterally. All right, so I'm going to talk about breeding hormones. So this is just a little picture of some work that we were doing, research we did many years ago, developing a callousing strategy and rooting strategy. These are pretty high rates of hormones, and you can see that poinsettias seem to respond very nicely to these higher rates. I'm not necessarily advocating you have to go to the high rates, but I'm pointing out that you can. But I would go at 1,000 in a treat the base of the cutting type scenario. You see a lot of guys going into treatment regimes where they go at a very low rate, and they'll go over top, and they'll go over the stuck cutting. And there's a lot of pros and cons with that. One, it's a very easy application method. It's safe. It's easy with the REI because you're already stuck the cuttings, etc. There's part of it. But you're going in at such a low rate that I don't know that you're getting the kind of efficacy that you can if you can figure out a way to treat the base of the cutting. Now, another method that we've seen done is having the hormone either incorporated into the medium that you're purchasing or sticking it into, or you treat that medium prior to stick as well. And then you can go in with the higher rate. But the bottom line is poinsettias respond beautifully to rooting hormones. It helps to even out the rooting across all the cuttings. That's the most important aspect. So even if you do go with a post-application spray of 250, 300 parts per million of IBA, you still get some benefit, but I don't think you get as much benefit as if you actually can get the base of the cutting. But that's a cost benefit conversation you have to have. Is it worth the cost of the labor to dip that cutting? There's a variety of different rooting hormones available out there, and I think there's good choices. I personally, I did a lot of work with Dip and Grow. I liked the liquid form. I liked that it's an IBA NAA blend. I felt I could keep my sanitation levels high by using a liquid. I didn't like the messiness of the powder. So used it either as a dip or diluted it and literally sprayed it carefully with a low pressure hand sprayer, small pump sprayer onto the base of the cuttings. The higher rates that we're talking about for the base of the cutting, it's very important that you don't get them up the stem because that will cause corking on the stem. Callus will form up the stem and it will cause some serious leaf distortion at the top. So if you're going to expose the higher parts of the plant to any of these hormones, you have to do it at a very low rate.
Gary, I'd just add that on the IBA applications over the top, I would trial that before actually using it in any large fashion in your facility. I've seen some pretty interesting malformations or, twisting and turning of leaves and stems at higher rates, especially on poinsettias. So
I have seen a lot of problems with that technique. I'm not an advocate. I'm with you. It can work, but Jason or James got something to say. Give it up, buddy.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that used to do that all the time. You get to trial it for a reason because you get used to the curl and deformation. So you know what the expected response will be, and also the resting time of when that leaf will start to come out. That's why we highly recommend, if you're going to do that, to trial it so you don't freak out the first time and use as low a rate as possible.
Yep.
And that'd be in that 75 to 100, 150 rate maybe to start with. Yeah.
But again, I would challenge you, if you're even contemplating doing that, if you're going to go through the experiment of trying that out, then do me a favor. Stick some cuttings in 1500, stick them at the same time and see who wins the game. And you decide, is it better, more even, faster rooting, or is it a lower cost of application? I can't answer that math equation. You have to do your own math. You're the grower.
Every situation is different.
Yep. So at the end of the day, what you want is a nice calloused cuttings. And what's really important, and this is why, if you can see, I like this photograph a lot because you can see the line from where the powder of the hormone was applied. You can see that kind of white fuzzies there in there. And then you see the nice, bumpy, not overly calloused formation of root initials coming. That's a stem that's going to throw a lot of roots, a lot of separate root tips. What you don't want to see at this point is a big fat round lump ball of callus at the bottom and nothing up the stems. If it's too moist around the base of that cutting, it'll just continue to form callus. It won't literally have any reason to make a root, right? So it's happy, you're giving it plenty of moisture and it's making callus. So they have to, you don't want to over treat it. So this is about perfect. And these will now be rooting literally. You can see the roots coming right now. Within 3 days, you will see roots outside on an oasis cube from this cutting. So again, that's the goal. You don't want that big lump on the bottom. You want a nice callus up the stem. If you see a lot of callus at the base, it's probably too wet. If you see brown callus at the base, it's probably too wet, and you probably got some fungus gnats too. So keep your eyes open. So starting from a callus cutting is an option, and we see more of them being done every year. It is basically where the cutting supplier at the farm, offshore farm, calluses the cutting for you. And depending on the variety, each variety is calloused for a specific amount of time, so that it brings it right to that point, not quite as advanced as what that photograph was, but very close to that point of being ready to root within a couple of days. And there's a benefit for that because it reduces the time you have in a sort of a more tender environment, and you don't have to have a full-blown propagation environment. You do want to be able to do frequent irrigations, but that tissue has already been acclimatized. The cutting has been hardened in, so that tissue, those leaves are going to be more durable and more tolerant of moisture. They don't need the heat to form the callus. They can be rooted at lower temperatures in the upper 60s and literally can be stuck on the floor. Most commonly done, you see it done in houses, direct stuck, like we were looking at the direct stick URC. That's the condition that they're mostly done. And most oftentimes the large producers are using fast moving booms over the top. But the difference is they're getting a rooted out product rooted in their media. In about 7 days, they're rooted out and ready to go. They're pinching that product, you know, in 2.5 weeks after sticking it in some cases. Some guys wait a little longer for the pinch, but the bottom line is it's a very quick process. You do have to think about in terms of it is a unrooted cutting in receiving it. It is all the it's got no roots, right? It's going to dry out. So you got to keep them moist, keep them turgid. If they come in a hot box, you want to exchange the gas. Ethylene gas is still a factor. You don't want the tissue really flaggy and rubbery. So even in that situation, even though it's already calloused, it's better to start with a nice turgid, fresh cutting. So treat it like an unrooted cutting and literally roll back to the beginning protocols that James went over on how to deal with it if it's hot. No hormone required. Again, a lot of mist. Fog is a glorious tool with this as well. You don't want to overwater. It's very easy to consider it like a URC. It's not. It's way more durable, and you just have to pay real close attention to your moisture management until you get used to it. It's more durable, and it's going to come out quickly. Now, what are the applications for this? Well, you can use it direct stick in the finished container, which I think is the most cost-effective application, but you can also do it if you're trying to run a fast run through a propagation environment, or you don't have the most ideal propagation environment. It's a little harsh, but you still want to run the liners just because of crop rotations and the like. It can be done both ways. There is a risk. The risk is if something goes wrong, your schedule is off. There is no readily availability of replacement callus cuttings. Because they have to be calloused and that's a week and a half in advance, and you have to be ordered and processed and all that. So the bottom line is if you mess up with the calloused cutting, you're now going to have to go shop for a liner. You're not going to be able to replace it with a URC. So there is a little bit of a risk, but it's a very effective product, and we see a lot of people using them quite well, and we're very comfortable with our supply chain. Okay, so Jason, you want to take over here?
Yep, thanks, Gary. So as Gary was showing with the slide with the picture of the callus, that really well-developed callus on the end of the cutting, that is the end of stage 1, and we're rolling into stage 2 now. We're starting to initiate roots. And so we got to start thinking about how we're going to change our environment, how we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're starting to fertilize a little bit more. We're changing our moisture management plan, reducing mist. And we'll walk through some of that stuff here on the next slides. So let's talk about the environment in stage 2. If we wanted to be really low stress, dark conditions, minimizing any kind of air movement, putting lots of mist or high humidity in the air in stage 1, we're going to actually start to pull back on that a little bit now in stage 2. So we're going to, if possible, start to increase light levels. And if we do start to increase light levels, it's because we're just starting to strike roots. Cuttings are getting a little bit, more able to handle the environment on their own, but we're not going to just pull the shade off and start to open the curtains up in the middle of the day. We're going to wean them off from the shoulders towards the middle of the day, right? And then, as far as soil temperatures and air temperatures go, you could start to change that a little bit, but there's not much you can do in the middle of summer in terms of trying to cool down as much as you'd like. For some growers, there's a little bit of heat needed because you do potentially get some cool nights. So you may have to put a little bit of heat underneath to just keep things moving. But you can also start to increase air exchanges, right? So you can start to crack the vent a little bit more and open maybe turn another fan on or let the roof open a little bit further so that you can get some more air exchanges, move a little bit more water through that plant. And that'll, of course, be bringing your relative humidity down. And when you're in stage 2, you need to have night mist off at this point. One of the biggest mistakes that I see from growers is not pulling that mist off quick enough. And it's human nature as a grower. The last thing you want to do is walk into your prop house in the morning and you get in there at 6:30 and all the poinsettias are flagging because you pulled the mist off too quickly. Well, as a propagator, you got to know where that line is and start backing off so that you can have mist off completely by the time you get to stage 2, with the goal of being totally off mist by day 14 if possible.
Yeah, you got to make those roots work. They need to work, otherwise they won't do anything.
Yeah, I mean, playing it safe and prop it's tough to do it because the plants will not be, you won't get them off mist as fast as you want. You will start to slow things down if you don't start to pull that back. So let's talk a little bit about fertility and moisture management. The first time you can really start putting some EC back in to the soil and to the media and fertility back in the cutting is you're starting to get into stage 2. The roots are starting to come out. They're going to start actively taking up the nutrition you put in. So it's really important at this stage that you're actually putting some EC back in. You're starting to feed the soil without fully saturating it. And you're hopefully starting to let that moisture level dry down a little bit. If you can get down to a level 3, that's going to help you push roots out. If you stay wet 4 or 5 all the time, your roots are not going to be very strong. You won't get a very strong start to your root system. It won't be very uniform. You'll have well-rooted stuff and not as well-rooted stuff. And so it just, your uniformity starts to go out the window from the very beginning if you're not careful. So it's really important. Start to get a little bit of a dry down there. Well-balanced fertilizers, ideally like a Cal Mag fertilizer that, my recommendation being that 100 to 150 part per million range. You can start to kick in some pretty good EC at this point and help those plants get going. And if you are feeding overhead and you're putting out decent parts per million, it's not a bad idea to rinse those plants off. We don't want to distort or tear up a growing tip because that could actually start branching a little earlier than we want. We won't allow that plant to grow as well as we'd like. So make sure you know your media pH as well coming out of prop, especially if you're direct sticking. You could have 0 EC and pretty darn high pH as you come out of propagation. So this slide, I really want to just kind of try to visually illustrate what a poinsettia might look like as it comes out of prop. In this case, this was a crop I grew years and years ago, 4 1/4 inch crop, direct stuck in week 32. Took my first media pH and EC sample in week 33. And if you look at those graphs down on the bottom, on the left-hand side is the pH. On week 33, pH is high. Week 34, it's still high. Well, it starts to come down week 34, 35, 36. Now look at the table on the graph on the right-hand side, and you can see kind of the opposite effect, right? That's the EC. EC in week 33, there's a little bit of EC in there. By the time you get to 34, nothing. And so I had to work really hard to start recharging that plant, getting the EC back in. And you can see week 35, 36, as that EC starts to come back up, pH is going down at the same time. And that relationship is consistent. You'll see that in the liner, you'll see that in your finished stage. As you start to feed more and EC goes up, pH starts to come down. If you have very little feed in there, you'll be riding the high side of your pH. So really, we just wanted to illustrate what that, in this case, a direct stick 4 1/4 inch would look like coming right out of prop. It's got nothing in it and pH is too high. You got to start fixing that. Bring EC up, bring your pH down. Okay, rolling into now stage 3. So we've got the cuttings off mist at this point, and we really need to change our environment, right? We've got the roots out, we've pulled the mist back, we're starting to feed, these plants are starting to actively grow and unfold a leaf here and there. And so we want to change the environment and really kickstart things and get it going. So we're continuing to build the EC in the media. A balanced fertilizer program, 150 to 200 parts per million might be a little bit on the high side, but if you're really hungry coming out of prop, you may need that. Maybe you want to be around 100 parts per million nitrogen because you want to be able to control a higher density environment in a liner tray. that's okay too, as long as you're comfortable with your nutrition level and you're not stalling things out. You do need to maintain your disease control, treat for fungus gnats, and if any whiteflies are around and your sticky cards, you want to be sure. It's a great time to do that in prop before you start to space things out, right, when you've got a higher density. And this might be the first time you apply any kind of PGR. So PGR applications here, you want to stack nodes up. So when you go to plant and pinch, you've got the right number of breaks underneath that pinch. What you don't want is a big, big stretch, any kind of large space between internodes. So at this stage for me, a cyclocell, 750, maybe 1,000, and maybe only want 500 based on where you're at, based on your light levels. But it's a good opportunity to start toning that plant up. And then for me, this is the best way to create a really nice liner or really get the product kick-started after propagation. When you're in stage 3, roots are now actively coming out, plants are starting to grow, leaves are unfolding. You need to change your environment. You need an active environment. And what does that look like? It looks like higher light levels. So maybe at this point, you're starting to pull the shade off, or you're opening your shade curtains more and you're going to take the paint off later. Either way, you're raising light levels. You're also increasing fertility. At the same time, if possible, you're pulling temperatures down, you're moving more air through that compartment, or you're opening those vents to allow for more air exchange, and you're trying to reduce humidity so you can get better transpiration, move more water through that plant, and keep things active.
James, you want to talk
Going back to diseases, stage
boy,
3.
man, you're just like the bug and disease guy.
Yeah, that's the low end of the totem pole, I guess, right now, huh? Young guy. Fungus gnats can be problematic, right? Still, they can be munching around, girdling cuttings if you're keeping your media a little too moist. Actually, that's a good one to check to make sure that you don't have that happening, because that can sneak up on you pretty quickly. Whitefly is now your primary pest. Make sure you're scouting continuously for this, developing a monitoring program, and having sticky cards out there just to make sure you don't have adults going around. You can also have Pythium and Rhizoctonia can start developing in this stage as you have, you're starting to dry down the media a little bit more. I mean, this is occurring during the summer. So, your targets will probably be your edge of crops where you have a little bit more air ventilation, drying out those. So those are the parts of the crop that I would monitor. And then you have your center of the crop where I would monitor your overwatering situation, right? Depending on how big the crop is, and your area of that crop, your ventilation and your air movement around can really cause some challenges in making sure your media moisture and your irrigation vents are even. So here you're just seeing some examples of some girdling and a little bit of Rhizoctonia coming in. This is what you want to make sure that you kind of avoid at this moment, right? So this is where you want to definitely, as you get into stage 3, think about doing something preventatively that are targeting funguses as well, right? So
This right here is stage 3 direct stick is where I see Rhizoctonia. If you haven't prevented it rearing its head, and can be pretty devastating, especially if we talked earlier about lateral movement of water. Rhizoc can spread pretty quickly in that kind of situation.
Yep. Again, here's some just some biocontrols options that you can use. We do have analogous chemical sprays as well. Again, all this information's in charts form and back of your catalog and available online. We just didn't want to take your time and dive too deeply into this presentation. Here we have a nice example of what you should expect in stage 3. You don't have a root-bound liner here. We're not waiting so long to transplant that we start to have laterals start to move. That can be an issue, especially once you go to pinch. And you have a nice green color. You're not hungry or deficient. Your lower leaves aren't showing that they're using a ton of nitrogen and yellow.
One thing on holding liners a little bit too long before planting is that it's hard to keep a liner wet when you get into you're in the middle of summer and you've got a ton of roots in there and the plants are starting to grow really actively. I mean, one hard dry down and damaged roots and Pythium's going to start to move in potentially. And so it's really important to get stuff planted on time, I guess.
I was
my
just going to say, I'm a
recommendation.
huge advocate of plant it as soon as you can pull it. If you can pull it and get it to pull nicely and it's got roots on the outside, you're better to get it in the next environment and get the thing rolling. You can start getting nutrition in the plant and you get air around it and light. You don't get that jammed up stretch and you don't frag your roots. So
Plant early instead of planting late.
mm-hmm.
I would also take this time before we move on to more of a finishing and we're out of propagation. We will be staying on after this webinar. Time expires past 2 to answer your questions that are filling up in the chat line that we see now.
All right, so now we've got it rooted. Now we're going to start from a liner. It's important that you plant into moist media. That root on a poinsettia is a tender thing, and it's the stress of getting it from the liner environment to your transplant line, through the line, in the box, in the truck, wherever, however that process is putting stress on that. Some mediums are easier to move water through into the finished medium. Oasis or other foams tend to dry out very quickly. The roots are in that foam, so as the plant transpires, it's drawing all the moisture out. You need to irrigate enough to where you keep that oasis moist and enough roots to hydrate the plant until the roots can egress out into the medium. And that's usually several days after transplant. So if you're coming from oasis, make sure you don't leave the oasis sticking up too high above the soil, because that's going to be just in addition to, you've just reduced the amount of area that's going to be able to hold water, and you've increased the surface area for your evaporation as well as the transpiration through the roots. So it's very important for those first few days to get that plant established into the medium. I like to do some shade, just reduction of stress, and again, kind of what we're talking about in propagation, frequent but lower irrigations, especially until they establish, and then you can start irrigating through. If you're in a flood situation and you transplant the liner, you're gonna have to water top down until that liner is established. You're not gonna be able to generate and move enough water through most mediums far enough up through the column to saturate and get into that. You're still gonna have to water from above. So keep that in mind too, that as soon as you transplant, you cannot go right to flood. You're gonna have to do overhead irrigation initially. Again, let the humidity rise a little bit and keep your shade pulled until they get well established. And again, all you're looking for really is the roots growing into the medium. Then that root system will take over, and then the media nutrition in that finished container will take over, and you'll have depleted what's in the liner, and you get down fresh roots and a whole fresh medium. So in that environment, it's a little bit more forgiving to a point, especially once you're transplanted. You can allow for some lower temperatures at night. You don't need to generate roots. Poinsettias grow very happily with nights down in 60 or so. Don't need to spend a lot of energy warming a poinsettia early in the production cycle. Again, you can allow them to cool down, especially in long days of summer, because you're going to get the solar gain, you're going to get the moles, you're going to get the ADT from that warmer temperatures during the day. You can play, it's not really ideal for the diff scenario. You can argue that and set your systems accordingly if you want to manage height control with it. But if you want to manage energy, you don't need to spend a lot of energy heating early in the crop. Later on, we talk about that more. High humidity strategies, you need to know when you need humidity and when you don't. It's very important that you have humidity around that crop when you pinch it. So as soon as you pinch the plant, and we'll get into that before it's done, you're going to need that humidity. But once the plant's established, humidity is not your friend. Humidity slows transpiration. Humidity creates environments for pathogens, and in some cases helps some insects as well. So you want to make sure that you're not, you don't have a continuous humidity scenario. You're going to have a humidity strategy based on where you are in the crop cycle. And as we, again, progress through these webinar series, we'll address those issues as we go. As I alluded to in that previous slide, high temperatures is your biggest challenge early on. A lot of places it's very hard to keep an active environment. So high temperatures are definitely a challenge. Growing medias, we've seen a lot of evolution in growing medias. So wood fiber has come in and become a really big part of the large grower system here. And it's a change in structural component, and we're seeing higher percentages every year going up as a percentage of the medium. It's important to understand that you really want is you want a sanitized medium, a sterile medium, or not necessarily sterile, but a non-pathogenic medium that is good air exchange. Poinsettia roots especially love air. You can't get a white root unless there's air around it. And then you also need to maintain a pH in that medium, ideally below 6.6. So we have always historically, peat light produced growers, myself, been born and raised on growing poinsettias in peat and various amendments. The peat is acidic. It allows us to use lime to manage the pH. When you're in like core or the wood fiber products, they're inert, and your lime management changes, and so does the chemistry change. And so we tend to see, if you're not paying attention to your feed regime and your media pH, we tend to see media pH rise in the end. We saw it in core, but we're seeing it as an issue to be managed, especially when you start getting to higher percentages of the wood fiber. The other thing about the wood fiber mix too is you can see here structurally, and you can kind of wanted to show this, is if you notice on the hydrofiber 60P40 hydrofiber mix, you can see the top of that media is very light in color, and it's beginning to dry down. Whereas on the control, similar plant, similar irrigation, you can see that the moisture, it's showing that more on top. The issue is you can't use the visual cues that you thought you knew when you're growing in a peat mix with a hydrofiber mix. You have to judge your irrigation. You have to understand the cues that are going to tell you what stage of moisture you're in. It's going to be different. So it's great stuff. It works really well. It's very cost effective. You just got to learn how to do it, like everything else.
Now, one thing, Gary, on the roots and the media, and as we're getting past our transplant phase and into really starting to build up the root system and bulk up the top, it is so important that you build a good root system underneath the plant, because if you do that, and I know it's hard this time of year, you're planting stuff up, it's hot, it can oftentimes very humid, and plants are stressed out a lot of times, and they're not taking up the water, and it can be tough to build a strong root system underneath the plant. If you don't do that, you lose control later. You can't push, you can't gain that inch a week or inch and a half a week if you need it to hit your height spec. So just put a ton of emphasis on building a strong root system early. If you do that, you got a lot of control later. You can do a lot of stuff with the plant as you need to push or hold it back or whatever. So,
and it's an excellent point, Jason. And it's the first of several sort of core foundational basics that you have to establish early in the crop. And we'll get into those as we continue. But the first one is you got to create an environment to produce a good root system, because that will enable everything else to happen. Without that root system, the rest of the pieces of the puzzle begin to challenge, and then we'll have other core steps. And if you can do these core steps in the early phase of the production, it's way easier to finish it. And you're not playing games at the end.
Yeah, no, it's a foundational step. It's an essential factor. So, all right, let's talk water quality, fertility. You guys probably have a good handle on your water quality. Obviously, that impacts the drift or the movement of the media pH. It impacts what kind of fertilizers you use. For me, I like to use a constant liquid feed program on poinsettias. I like to be in that 150 to 250 range. When we're post-transplant and we're getting close to pinching this product and we're pushing these breaks out and we're expanding leaves rapidly, we need to be feeding. We want this product to be going. We want to get off to a strong start. Again, you can hold back later as needed, but it's hard to catch up as days start to shorten and light levels change and temperatures cool off if you don't get off to a good start. So, just focus on getting the right amount of fertilizer into that media as this plant's really starting to take off. For me, you could also kick feed that's what I used to call it. If I wanted to drop in a higher feed because I felt I was a little behind, kick this thing in the shorts, give it 300 parts per million at 350, give it a good shot of ammoniacal nitrogen, expand the leaves, get it going if you really need to. Don't be afraid to feed this product or this plant as you're coming out of propagation and or post-transplant.
As long as you don't dry down hard, you can put a lot of nutrition in through the roots of a poinsettia.
Okay. And then finished crop, just talking about the growing media and really talking media EC. Depending on where you're at or what kind of sampling method you use, whether it's pour through or a 1-to-2. Some people I know are probably using a direct stick probe. You want to have a relatively high level of fertilizer. So whatever you're using for sampling, make sure that you understand how to read and interpret your results, and make sure you're putting in a good amount of fertilizer into that poinsettia pot. And one thing you may notice, and I used to notice this when I was tracking poinsettia media in EC, when they were actively growing, really growing fast, I could be putting 250, 300 parts per million in, and every week the EC was still low. Well, that told me that the product's actually using the EC up, which is a good thing, right? Plants looked great. If I was trying to get that EC up a little bit, sometimes I couldn't if it was growing really well and I had a good root system. So
I think that brings that's an outstanding point, Jason. I just wanted to throw something in there too, just on that point, is because they grow so rapidly. It's difficult to judge exactly what your nutrition is by the media EC unless it's climbing. If it's climbing, it's telling you red flags, red flags. If you're feeding constantly and it's climbing, look at your roots. But what I say is to Jason's point is, and that's I love a low EC on a happy, rapidly growing poinsettia, as long as I know I'm feeding it every time. So I'm obsessive with testing what's in the hose as much as I am as what's in the media. So know what's in the hose.
Yeah, no, every fertilizer has a certain EC at a certain part per million. So just make sure you're putting on what you think you're putting on. Just because it's coming out blue doesn't mean it's the right EC or it's the right rate. And don't forget your molly. This is where you start putting it in. All right, James, you're up.
Yeah, PGR applications and pinching. So this is where you really want to start to not only just see what your growth is going on, you want to start making your PGR decisions. All right, and really about when to pinch and your PGR applications after the pinch to then get a nice even canopy. So kind of a old school method that still is valid for some poorly branching varieties is a Forel sandwich, which is you're doing applications of Forel 5 days prior and 5 days after the pinch. And this can cause a PGR effect that you kind of see throughout the crop cycle, right? As well as the rates for this, we would go with a 200 to 400 ppm rate. And some of the varieties, some of the newer genetics from us and Selecta One, as well as the other companies as well, may not require this Forel sandwich. So when we say this is optional, this is the beauty is the eye of the beholder when it comes to poinsettias. And this is one of the things that is not quite necessary for some of the newer genetics.
Agreed. So when we talk about pinching, and this has been, I wanted to grab this topic because it's something I'm passionate about over the decades as poinsettia genetics have evolved and old techniques had to evolve. One of the critical techniques that have had to evolve is pinching. And we in the past we needed to use things like the Forel sandwich to entice branching. And some older genetics we needed to get what we consider a relatively hard pinch. And we used to think that we needed the plants rooted out to the side of the pot and all the way to the bottom and be in tree trunks before we pinched them. That is not the case today. And it is important to understand that that is a very dangerous thing to do today, because if you wait too late to pinch, these modern genetics that are free brancher or better branching are going to start to branch on their own, but they're not going to branch evenly. They're going to branch based on the oldest node on that plant. And it usually going to rear its head from under the soil or right at the soil line. And it's going to be 2 or 3 inches long by the time you pinch, and it's going to run and become the center of the plant. And that will throw your plant off balance. So we're going to go through some, some visual examples of what I'm going to talk about here and just kind of show you what you want to look for and what to watch out for. And James will come in and we'll finish up this concept about talking about the PGR around the pinch and how that affects the final potential architecture of the plant. So 12 to 14 days is sort of the typical timeline that I prefer. It's in the old school conversation, it is not a hard pinch. It is not what we'd call a soft pinch. It would be a medium pinch. And if you question the branching of genetics, you could remove the top leaf if necessary, that what we would call soft pinch leaf removal concept. But really, this is more of a medium pinch. Plants don't need to be fully rooted out. They just need to have an active root system. And this is important. Again, free branching genetics branch, and typically when they're pinched, every node will form. So if you wait too late to pinch and you leave 12 breaks on that 6-inch pot, you're going to have 12 breaks to contend with. And you might go, ooh, that's beautiful. But no, it's not. That's a nightmare. You want, 5 or 6 bracts on a 6-inch pot. That's manageable. And it's also going to give you your height width ratio that you designed in your spacing, which we'll talk about later. So again, don't leave too many leaves. That's really important. The other thing is it's really important that you pay close attention to the humidity right around the pinch. You don't want that plant really stressed out prior to the pinch. If that hardened out, that can potentially have some damaging effect on the nodes that you're trying to develop. You need humidity around the pinch and after the pinch. If you don't want to throw a lot of water on the crop itself, if you have a boom, a super quick pass, if you have mist nozzles, fog, kick that on a little bit. You can throw the shade up. But a technique I like, which doesn't put water in the crop, is to water everything in that greenhouse but the crop. The sidewalks, the floors, everything gets moisture to raise humidity without adding water into the pot, because you're relatively new transplant and you're probably a little bit on the wet side because you're not fully rooted out yet. So here you go. This is 13 days after transplant. This is Christmas Feelings. This was grown in a pinch trial we did in a greenhouse in the Central Valley of California. Hot, dry, not an ideal place for poinsettias. But here you are, you're 13 days after transplant, ready to pinch. To me, that's an ideal example of what you want to pinch. There is that plant pinched. Now, I would have probably pinched it 1 leaf lower, but again, this was a grower doing this, and I really love what they did. So it's really great. Here's what it looks like 7 days after the pinch. Now, I wanted to point out in this picture, if you look on the left side, you see that shoot that is the biggest shoot on that plant right now. That is from the bottom of the plant. That's a common scenario in modern poinsettias. An old school poinsettia from 20 years ago, that would always be the top shoot, would be the dominant shoots. But in the modern poinsettia, because that shoot has already started to form even before we pinched, even after 13 days, you can still see it's one of the dominant ones on the plant. But this is kind of the end game that you want. This is a week after the fact. And you can see this was a low a poly greenhouse in a inhospitable environment. And these guys are, they're wizards. They're really good at it. But the bottom line is you can see if you control the environment right and you get the pinch right, this is what you're looking for. A nice little cluster of growing shoots forming on the top of the plant. And if you do it right, you get an even branch response. But pinching is only the first piece of the puzzle. James, you want to come in and talk about the second piece of this puzzle?
Yeah, for after you're pinching, and like Gary had mentioned, you start to have that apical dominance coming from the bottom of the shoot after you pinch. This is where you want to get in your early PGR applications, okay? You want to go from a 500 to 1,000 ppm cyclosil application in a warmer environment with higher light. You might want to add B9 to that and go to 1,000 to 500, right? But make sure you're not doing a late 4-inch crop. And I'm having the wonderful person start to interrupt me. Yeah, that's my dog. And then after pinching, you want to use a cyclosil spray to kind of even out your finished product there as those laterals are coming out.
Here, James, let me take over. So
yeah. Apparently, we've gone over time, and I didn't give enough attention.
Okay, I got this. So I think what you're trying to do is that early PGR applications are not about height control effectively. What they're really about is architecture, right? You're trying to create the architecture of the plant. And so what you want to do is you want to think in terms of this, is when you use a B9 or a cycocel or a B9 cycocel as a spray, you can apply that very lightly, a very just kind of mist down over the top. What these chemicals do is they affect the meristem closest to the leaf of the leaves that they touch. So in other words, the leaves that are dominant on that plant, the ones that are expanding the most, that are on the top of the plant, are going to get more growth regulator, and they're going to check down. And then the ones that are smaller underneath, hiding under that canopy, they won't get any growth regulator, and it gives them a chance to catch up. So it's about building this plant's architecture, and that's kind of what we're goal here. You do not want to use drenches at this phase. It's very important because drenches respond on the shoots more evenly, all the shoots equally, than does the sprays, which affect what they touch. So this picture right here. Now we did this little experiment, and this was kind of fun, and of course the plant on the left was. We did everything wrong, right? We did everything that we should do wrong. We did not apply any PGR early. We pinched it late, and we bonsai drenched it a week after pinch. And you can see what I did is I pinched it late. I got the architecture wonky. I didn't PGR the liner, so it's out of whack anyway. And then I locked that dysfunction in place by drenching it. So the message really here is don't use a drench early. But on the other side, by doing a couple of light cycocel applications post-pinch, you can see what we're able to do is we're able to even out those breaks and effectively make a nice architectured plant. So that is the end game from the pinch and the early PGR. So that brings us to a conclusion, Jason.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, so that wraps up from the stick to the pinch. So we're excited to keep this going. This is the end of part number 1. We're going to have part 2 coming up again at the end of July. So we've got a while to go there, but at that point we'll go from pinch to where we get to bract development, and that's a huge focus on making your specs. It's sizing up your crop, and it's quite often that's your make or break in terms of whether or not the quality of that crop is going to be where you want it to be. So we're looking forward to seeing you at the end of the month. Thank you for being on. Thank you for being on today. I think the next slide, Gary, has our technical information here. So, or I should say our contact information. If you guys have any questions, please reach out to Gary, to James, to myself. We are happy to answer questions via email. Anytime you guys have a challenge, have a question, you want to throw something by us, and we're happy to give you our feedback. So we really want to interact with you. We want to help you succeed with your crop, regardless of what genetics you're growing. We want to help you have a really good poinsettia season.
Excellent, and I think that will take us to a little bit of Q&A. I think we have time to ask a few of the questions that have come through in the chat. If you guys are ready, I'm gonna fire off some questions. First question came up early on is about LED lighting during propagation. Is this something you guys have experience with? Is it something you recommend? And if so, at what stage would you turn on the LEDs?
I don't think supplemental lighting of any kind is required for poinsettia propagation in the normal cycles of our production when we're doing it for fall sales. I think if you're going to do like a tree, and we can do very early spring propagation, or you're growing your own stock or something like that, I think supplemental lighting becomes an issue. It certainly becomes an issue when you're in short days. They have to have long days. So LEDs are very effective. I think they work really good. It's not something you really think about as adding lights in propagation and poinsettias. Now, to finish, that's a whole different conversation.
We'll mention the running a risk of running lights in propagation. Knew a grower that did their poinsettia propagation and then flipped it and had done mum propagation, right? They had it set so they were doing night interruption for their mums. And when they went to go put their finished crop back into that area, no one checked to make sure that those lights were coming on at 10 o'clock at night. Those poinsettias never turned red.
Gotcha. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Second question got into chemical use. And do you still see people using chemicals like Safari for fungus gnat controls, or are more people getting away from neonics? What's the trend looking like right now?
I would say from what I've seen, people have moved away from neonics for sure. Doesn't mean that it isn't being used, and quite often growers still use a neonic application late in the production cycle to give that systemic control against whiteflies. But in propagation, I'm not seeing many growers using Safari for fungus gnat control. It tends to be biologicals. It tends to be IGRs, insect growth regulators that really target the larvae.
It also depends on who they're growing for. I mean, some of these growers are kind of put into a box by who their retailer is or who their consumer is. And even though it will never, ever come across with a pollinator during its pollen phase, neonics aren't allowed in any form.
That's good advice. Remember the retailer and who's selling that product.
We can debate at another time in person whether that makes a lot of sense, but yeah.
Excellent. That's why Jason shared the contact information. Sounds like a good debate to have one-on-one. Next question was about, is stage 3 the right time to stop shading altogether if your only options are full shade or no shade?
That's a good question. I mean, in my experience, in the heat of the summer, you're going to need some kind of shade anyway. We need to keep the leaf temperatures down on the plant. So if you are adding extra shade for propagation to keep light levels low, stage 3 is when you would start really increasing quite a bit. You can start to increase in stage 2. Stage 3, you can really get to where you're either completely removing all the shade or just really increasing light levels, and then taking some of the sort of the top off it, or the stress in the peak of the day, adding a little bit of shade there.
If you're in a situation and you're in a hot environment, a hot summer, and you have a choice of either the shades on or the shades off, leave it on and do an extra cycocell to compensate for that. I'd rather see you do that than run the risk of just causing a great deal of stress on a plant that isn't really fully acclimatized yet. But again, it's really going to be, if you have a milder environment and it's not really hot and it's not really stressful, then yeah, peel off the shade and stage 3. But if it's the one time, if you're washing it off, if it's painted, I'd leave it on without question. If your only option is you have an 80% piece of shade cloth, yeah, then you debate the environment. So loaded question.
I'm going to go with one more, and it's specific to a product from Espoma called rock phosphate. Do you have any suggestions on using this after the roots have developed on a direct stick 6.5-inch pot? So any advice on rock phosphate?
Keep it in the media. It's not a problem. Be careful what the rate is. Know what the grind is. Know rock phosphate as a component, as a nutrient component, is effectively its release rate is going to be dependent on a variety of factors. It won't cause, if it's in the medium, the issue with the phosphorus damage on a poinsettia is only based on the getting on the foliage. So if it's in the medium, it's fine. If you're going to apply it over the top of the poinsettia, no, don't do that. But if it's incorporated into your medium, I don't have a problem with it. But just realize that how does that interact with the rest of your entire feed regime? Because that is now going to be a factor.
Okay, no, I think that's good advice. So I think that this kind of wraps up our session. I appreciate you guys sticking around for a little bit of Q&A. It's definitely been a good discussion. I think that we've seen quite a bit of good information, and with a lot more to come in the next 2 webinars. So Jason, Gary, James, again, thank you for taking the time to cover this critical stage of poinsettia production. We all know getting off to a great start is the best way to ensure success throughout your entire process. And if you want more, like Jason mentioned, we've got you covered. We have 2 more webinars coming up with the same group of panelists. Part 2 on July 30th will take us from pinch through to bract development. And part 3 on September 9th is going to complete the series with a discussion about finishing the crop and sending it to market. Just a quick reminder, again, this webinar is going to be archived at growertalks.com/webinars. You'll find this one there, as well as just about every webinar that we've done in the past. So a wide range of topics. So I think that's it for today. So on behalf of our panelists at Selecta One, I'm Bill Calkins, Senior Editor with Grower Talks, wishing you a fantastic poinsettia season.